Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Mindshift, where we are exploring what it takes to be a sustainability leader today, including the skills and capabilities and, of course, the mindsets that are essential for success. I'm your host, Brad Pierce, and today we are very excited to have Samantha Svoboda here with us. Hi, Samantha.
Hey, Brad. How are you?
Good. Thanks. Let me tell the audience, listeners, a little bit about you. Samantha is the creator of the Green Business Lab, which is a business sustainability simulation game, something near and dear to my heart. This platform engages participants. It draws on real-world examples of success and measures performance in terms of the triple bottom line, or for those of you that don't know the triple bottom line, that's basically people, planet, profit. Samantha also previously has worked in academia, including the University of Michigan and Georgetown University. And she's been both teaching business simulations and also a training consultant leading workshops and simulations in sustainable business and leadership and business acumen. So we're really excited to have Samantha here with us today. Hi, Samantha. Thanks for
sharing. Hi there.
Nice
to see you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it because as I mentioned, business simulations are one of the reasons why I got into this area and created Sustainability Mindshift. Let's talk about your business, the Green Business Lab. So tell me a little bit about your background and what sort of inspired you to come up with this idea.
Sure. Well, like so many people working in this field, it all started with a love of nature, which we generally all share. But the idea for combining simulation and sustainability really started back when I was at the University of Michigan. After I earned my MBA, I was hired to start a joint degree program between the business school and the School of Environment, which way back then was one of the first kind of programs of that type. Mm-hmm. And so part of my job was meeting with the faculty at the different schools. And I was so impressed how the two groups, the people at the School of Natural Resources and Environment, it was an old stone brick building. There was an organic garden in the atrium. Mm-hmm. People like to have long conversations where they really hashed a subject out till completion, and they wrote in prose. That was what they were most comfortable with. And of course, then I was moving over to the business school where it was fluorescent lighting, everybody was in suits, and it was bullet points. And while I was working, I was so impressed that both of these groups had so much to contribute to the topic of business sustainability. And yet there was this issue of trust between the groups because they didn't speak the same language. They had different preferences in terms of how they communicate, what they communicate, where they communicate, the whole thing. And both groups had such important, valuable knowledge. The problem couldn't be solved without really getting the contribution of both sides. Mm-hmm. And that didn't even include the engineering and public policy and law and all the other disciplines, I'm sure I'm forgetting many, that need to be included in solving this problem. Mm-hmm. So at that point, way back then, I started looking for the platform or the experience that would bring people together and allow them to speak in their own way, with their own thoughts, from the heart and their own perspective, but do it in a way that they could actually move forward together with a new perspective, a shared mindset that was better than the one that they came into the experience with. And I looked around, I spent quite a bit of time looking for that, and I really didn't find the experience anywhere. Mm-hmm. It led me to, as you mentioned, to going to work for some other simulation companies because I was impressed with that method of learning. But again, back then, there weren't sustainability simulations. They were about business acumen or leadership. So I learned what I could from that experience, and I started to develop the Green Business Lab on my own.
That's fantastic. Yeah, even today, there aren't that many out there, especially ones that are like yours, which is why I was happy to find you in the internet. I think it was a couple of years ago now, and we've been in touch since. And your work has helped shape my thinking in this field, which is awesome.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, I mean, it's really inspirational. So tell us about I happened to work for a company for a few years that offers business simulations. That's their methodology of teaching leadership has nothing to do with sustainability. It's all business. So tell me a little bit about then, for those listeners that have either been through a business simulation of their own, whether it was in grad school or in their line of work, how does the Green Business Lab itself differ from other types of business simulations?
Okay. Well, first off, just to set the playing field level for everybody. So a business simulation, any business simulation, usually divides participants into teams who are running companies. Usually they do it as a leadership team running companies, and the companies are all competing with one another. So that's just what we're talking about when we talk about business simulation. So one of the things that's really different about the Green Business Lab is that to approach the subject of sustainability, which includes environmental and social issues, you're really going into different kinds of territory because you're talking about subjects that touch people's values. People don't have the same, connection with accounting or finance as they do when you're talking about the planet and the people living on it. Mm-hmm. And so one of the essential things that needed to be different in order to build that trust that I talked about everybody that comes in needs to be able to participate, is that there couldn't be a black box in this simulation. And by that, I mean, many simulations have a little part of the calculation, the algorithms that calculate the results for the competition, that participants don't really get to see. It's something that just kind of cranks out the results and nobody really knows what happens in that process. And I realized from the start, one, to build trust, and two, if people are really going to learn, that process had to be completely transparent so that they could easily track the decisions they made with the outcomes that they achieved. Mm-hmm. And also, since it's a team-based and there's multiple teams, in order for them to learn from the experience of other teams, kind of see the path that they didn't take, they also had to be able to see the decisions that team made and the outcomes that they had. Mm-hmm. And so removing that black box, I understand why a lot of simulation companies have black boxes. It's a lot easier to design a simulation with that, but it was essential, and we were successful, that there is no black box and participants can see what they're doing all the way through. And that way they can compare their results with what they hope to achieve and learn from it and improve over the several iterations.
It's interesting. Yeah. That's one of the things I was, pondering back in the day when I worked for this company. There was the algorithms or the modeling, that happens behind the scenes. And I was actually surprised that there wasn't any at the time. I mean, there was no demand for it with this company anyway, but there was no sort of inclusion of sustainability data and metrics that, took into account, additional set of stakeholders or, maybe longer term thinking versus shorter term thinking and the environment and society as stakeholders that need to be considered as leaders are making these very complex decisions, both in terms of how they manage their people and their teams and meeting their business objectives, in the tension that exists in these business simulations. You've got to make decisions in a short period of time, that there weren't things that were included that would actually get them to have that aha moment at the end of the day after going through the experience and reflecting on that experience, that their decisions do impact, stakeholders that they may not be otherwise thinking of or aware of. And I know you have some, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I can say, I know why that's more difficult. If you think about it with the sustainable business simulation, we're not only, the participants are not only using all the business acumen and leadership and all those other skills that the other simulations are teaching, but they're also doing it on a really complex and nuanced subject that, as we mentioned, can touch values. So it's really adding another whole big complicated layer on top of the simulation. And really, if you're doing it well, integrated into the regular business functions. It's very different.
Yeah, and teaching leaders how to incorporate value-based decisions into their everyday thinking, which is hard, because I know that what I found from working at a big bank, I was seeing leaders that cared very much about the environment. Their intentions were good in terms of having the bank be an environmental leader. but they weren't necessarily making daily decisions or thinking about these things that you would need to consider as for a truly sustainable business to be successful in their daily lives. And so that was the big conundrum for me, is how do you teach them to incorporate those values and that way of thinking? And so one of the ways I noticed that you do it, which is really interesting, that some other simulations may not use, is that you actually work with a physical product, right? You use, I think you do tell me more about the physical product aspect.
Yeah, well, it's a spear mover. So we're working in a fictional industry, and it is a physical product that's made out of Connect's components. And, way back when I started the design on this, I had the idea of using a physical component back then, primarily because the topic was so new. And again, you could have a contentious environment between business and environment. And having something that's fun and playful was a way to relieve that tension, because how upset can you get? It's a little toy spear mover, right? So you engage people with that, and but they get very involved. There's something about the playfulness of it, and it's so engaging. And I think just the hands-on nature of it really means that people get attached to the physical product. At the end of the simulation, lots of people say to me they don't want to take the spear mover apart. They want team photos with their spear mover. So there's something very engaging with it. And people start to speak their truth about whatever they're thinking about the environment or social issues at hand. And they speak very candidly, because again, it doesn't look like it's a tense, contentious environment. We're talking about, these little, essentially cars that move little ping pongs down a test track. But what they're speaking, that truth that they're speaking, is serious. It's real. And that is just wonderful for the debriefs, both within the team to figure out how to move forward, and then for all of the teams together. You are able to unlock candid conversation in a way that I don't think that you could do otherwise. I have to say, over the years, I always thought that I may stop having a physical product as things are getting more and more digital, but I've really realized that it is the magic of the simulation.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I've always experienced, even unrelated to sustainability, but exercises in workshops where there's some tangible component like that, and often Legos are used in that case, is really, engaging and gets, to your point, gets people talking, gets people, they sort of step out of their, comfortable, and they're able to step out of their shell a little bit more, because their focus is on something that's external, as opposed to where business leaders spend a lot of their time inside their own heads.
And I also thought that that may work only for like 20s and 30-year-olds, but I've seen executives of all ages very engaged in the simulation and in the spear mover. So it's not something that you time out of. It's engaging and appealing to everyone. I think it really, draws from something deep inside of us.
Yeah, and it sounds like what you were saying too is that when I heard the word team mentioned a lot. I mean, because you're broken into teams, and because some of these challenges are team based, I imagine the metaphor, the story that you've set up for this, for the learning to occur inside of this story, that there's a lot of different probably additional skills that leaders can practice and learn and reflect on, and see how they show up in these spaces around things like teamwork that might not be their specific learning objectives going into the simulation. They might have very specific set of outcomes that they want, but that these are additional benefits that they gain just from the experience itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that was really important too is that we meet each participant that comes in wherever they are. So, regarding sustainability, whether they've thought about it for a lifetime or not at all, they've got something that they can recognize and engage with right away in the simulation. And a lot of times that might be the team, because now right away they aren't doing this challenge alone. They have, six other executives that are on this executive team with them, each with their own perspectives and knowledge. And they all help each other and support each other and challenge each other and really move each other forward. Those discussions, when you have an opportunity to listen to them, are just fascinating. But it's important because people do come in with different levels of not only thought or consideration about the environment, but with different skill and different knowledge. It's really important to make sure, and we've been very careful in the simulation, that people can always find something that they're comfortable with, grab onto that, and then engage in the learning from there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So even I would imagine, so if let's say a business itself hires you to bring this game in-house into their organization, I would imagine they also have multiple people from across disciplines, across organization, different departments that come in. And so even within the context of different departments, I imagine different players, different leaders come in with different sets of challenges that they have, whether it's internal challenges or even external challenges around different types of regulation or compliance that they have specific to their department,
Yeah, and this is what's interesting is that, there's no way that you can entirely plan who's going to learn what, because you don't know what each individual needs to learn. But generally, as I said, it's when we meet them where they are, they find what that is. So a couple examples I have of sort of personal learning from going through the simulation, something that you couldn't have predicted in advance. One fellow told me that he came into the simulation early in his career. He was just out of grad school, and he was just gung-ho on sustainability, and he was recommending to his team that they do every sustainability initiative out there, and he was really pressing them. And the team tempered him. They didn't go along with all of his suggestions, and upon reflection, he was so happy that they didn't, because he said if they had, the company would have gone bankrupt, and they wouldn't have been doing any good. And so, for him, his learning was that it needed to be a balance of environmental, social, and profitability, that you had to meet the business objectives along with achieving those other goals. And so that was the way he took it. Now, a related lesson from another fellow who was 20 years he'd spent in his career in environmental roles throughout that 20 years. And his lesson was that as his team got to one of those deadlines, and there was a lot of pressure to get their product designed and to get all their decisions finalized, he heard himself say to the team, "Forget the environment, we've just got to get the product out the door." And he just stopped cold. He couldn't believe that he had just said those words. And I actually saw him, and he stepped back away from the table for a minute and just reflected on what happened. And he said in that moment, he realized he had a visual of all the times that other people that he was talking to about sustainability in his work had ignored him. And he realized that unless the goals of environment and social are embedded with the mission of getting the product out the door, those goals were always going to get put to the side when they came to one of those deadlines that would inevitably come. And so his thing wasn't the balance of the three. His personal lesson was the integration. It had to all be at one. And those are the kind of lessons that each person experiences their own individual insight, because they have the opportunity and the platform to allow them to get that personal insight.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, he was under tremendous pressure, which is so common, right? Especially today, right. Increasingly, and with other additional external pressures like COVID, leaders there's just so much going on, and so it's hard. I mean, I often question, like, how is it that we're going to get sustainability to become a core part of what a business does if leaders are not trained to think that way, because they've grown up traditionally through the organization, and that's how they've made decisions, or they've gone to traditional business school, and with all these other tremendous pressures, it's understandable that you fall back on your your old behaviors or your way of making, which is usually profit driven, or in this case time sensitivity, and And I love the example that you gave, because it is a very personal example that everybody comes out of there not only with shared learning objectives or shared learning outcomes, but very personal learning outcomes that they've had by being in that moment of pressure and feeling that tension and getting so involved in the story and in this, and wanting to, in some cases, win the game, or it's not a game, but, sort of come out ahead of the rest of the teams.
Meet their goals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned, how do we do it? And this is why, how do we get executives to that point? Practice is essential. It can't just be an intellectual exercise. It's got to be practice. Mm-hmm. Because unless and in a condition, under pressure, under business pressure, with a team, with other people that you're having to consider, whether it's your internal team or the stakeholders, you have to practice in that context. Because again, if you aren't practicing there and you're just doing something intellectual, when you're when you go back to work and you're faced with those same pressures, that's where you need to apply it. You need to practice in a situation that's similar to where you're going to have to implement those new behaviors.
Yeah, it sounds like any sort of team sport too. If you think about basketball, like you can be the best basketball player and know the strategy and what the team is, the goals of the team and everything. But when you get out on the field or on the court, because people are involved, there's so much unpredictability. And so even if, a sustainability leader has all the sort of the boxes to check in terms of what they need to do to get the strategy executed successfully, which I think a lot of, management consulting organizations are doing a great job of today, saying, let's help develop a strategy and sort of how to get from point A to point Z. But without an environment to actually practice those skills, and sometimes even, challenging environment that's not necessarily accepting of those, kinds of, stepping out of the box a bit and practicing some more sustainable type behaviors and decisions. There's no way for them to understand, like in a basketball game, where the ball is going to be, where the next player is going to be. They have to think on their feet and get used to that comfort of that feeling of being in that environment. So I love that provides that playing field for them. And
it goes way back to where I started with the different functional areas when I was starting up the Herb Institute. I mean, there are so many different viewpoints that need to be accommodated and included, and very different viewpoints. And so practice is absolutely essential, because there's no way you can plan out the strategy like you're saying. But I've seen so many cases, and this was part of my idea way back when I was organizing meetings from these different constituents. People could think that they had agreed to some paper, but when they went to implement it, there was all sorts of nuance. Mm-hmm. And both sides had put in their own perspective and thought they knew what that nuance meant. And it wasn't a shared agreement at all. Mm. And so, there's so much to environmental, so much complexity, so much nuance, so much that needs to be integrated when you're talking about the environment and the people living on the planet, that you really need to practice regularly. And you can go through one cycle and think that you've got it, and then new challenges come up the next cycle and you realize that you've got more to practice.
Yeah, especially in today's age, it sounds like with, the rise of stakeholder capitalism and stakeholder, collaboration, essentially, putting yourselves in the shoes of another stakeholder is so important, and being able to sort of anticipate, their perspectives and their way of being and knowing it. And so I love that. That's a good example from the first example you shared, about how there was someone that wanted to, just totally invest in everything green, go gangbusters green, and I think that's oftentimes, if Melker were here, he probably would ask this question, coming from a younger generation. There's oftentimes this growing population of I hate using the terms millennials, et cetera, but younger generation that are entering the workforce and are soon to be the majority of a workforce. They have different values than, say, someone from my generation or older, and so their interest in sustainability, especially when you're new in the business, when you've just come out of graduate school, let's say, and you have all this great vision and passion, I found this too at the bank, where you have people say, let's just invest in, panels, green panels, everybody should just go 100% renewable energy and all that kind of stuff. And not really understanding the business side of the equation on the one hand. So you've got the generational differences, even in considering the stakeholders and what their thoughts are and their passions, and trying to acknowledge that, while at the same time helping them understand too the business side of things, that they have to be thoughtful about all the other complexity that exists in just running a business,
Right.
separate from.
I would say that the younger generations definitely feel a greater sense of urgency, and it's understandable that they do. But the thing goes back to the original question: how do we create a platform where everybody can come together and share their perspective? So the people that are urgent in the same conversation with the people that are like, okay, but we got to accomplish the business goals. And how do you put in and all the other perspectives that come in there? And how do you combine all of those and come out with something that works at the other end? And that's what we're practicing. Because one perspective isn't better than the other. There's aspects from everybody's knowledge and experience that need to be added into the solution.
So how do you do that then?
Pot.
Yeah, so you've got all this different knowledge right out there, and
Right.
certainly environmental knowledge about environmental and social issues, even themselves, are constantly changing. We have new information every day as science evolves, especially around climate change, for example. How do you integrate that new knowledge and thinking into your lab to stay current?
Right. So there's a couple of things. There's first of all, I'm going to say what we try to do to structure that kind of messy conversation of everybody coming in and contributing their own ideas and perspective is we give them frameworks so that they have, whether it's a life cycle analysis or it's a corporate social responsibility or whatever framework the client says that they really want to work with. We've got a number of different ones. That then every person has some way, some view of how to begin, where to begin solving this problem, and then a few good examples. All of the examples in the there are challenges. The teams face different leadership challenges and problems, but they're also given a bunch of solutions, positive actions that they can take. And they're positive because, again, a number of people come into the lab thinking about environment in terms of limitation. You're going to make me give up something. This is about regulation and barriers and limitation and cost and losing something that you find precious today. And so what we make sure is that everyone is presented with a framework that they can use for decision making, and then a few examples that can be their favorite kind of, they can pick from a wide range, but have some favorites. So when they leave, they have a place to start. And to really frame it into there's so much to do, and how do we get started? And we just walk away from that part of limitation. But then you also talked about how do we keep it fresh? And so the environmental and social issues are changing all the time. And we've, from the beginning, a lot of, I said before that a lot of simulations have an algorithm or a black box. They're also tightly scripted around some of those calculations, which makes updating them and adding, custom features more difficult. But we really designed this lab as a platform with different modules so that you can easily add in different content, both planning it in advance and selecting as you're setting up the lab which content you want to focus on. But also we have ways dynamically in the lab. We have a directory, a cache of stakeholders, people that we have pictures and names and different roles that they play. And those stakeholders can be engaged dynamically. And that means that in the middle of a simulation, if you have an idea and you want to interject it live and have the teams respond to it, they can be introduced right in the middle of play. And that way you're as current as whatever the news is that morning.
That's amazing. So it sounds like not only can this lab be customized a bit for the audience, but also on the fly, literally
Yes,
customized on the fly.
absolutely. Yes. So yeah, it's intended again to really help people learn. It's all about how do you really learn about sustainability. You can't address the topic all at once. So it's very customizable so that you can focus it on the area that you want. And then it's dynamic. So you can, see what people understand and what they are missing in the lab dynamically, and introduce additional challenges through the stakeholders in the lab to make sure that they really are thinking through some of the sticky points.
That's amazing. I love it. I wish we had a whole couple hours to talk. I mean, there's so many questions I still have, and I know that I'm sure the listeners do too. If anybody's interested, they can look for the Green Business Lab and reach out to Samantha for more information about how to bring that lab to their particular audience or business.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear from them.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on this as a guest, Samantha.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Brad.
much for your insights, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you later.
Very good. Nice
All right.
talking with you today.
Thank you.
Okay.